"I'll grow up, then I'll marry you." The boy said it as if he were stating a fact, not laughing, not blushing, not seeking approval. He stood barefoot on the warm concrete outside the small rural library, a paper cup of juice clenched in both hands, eyes lifted toward her with a seriousness far too heavy for someone so young. "I'll grow up," he said again, slower this time as if clarity mattered. "And when I do, I'll marry you." The alien girl froze. Her name, at least the one humans could pronounce, was Ira. To the observers of her world, she was an envoy-class anthropologist, assigned to long-term human behavioral study in low-density population zones. Children, she had been told, were emotionally expressive but cognitively unreliable. This one did not match the model. She knelt so they were eye level, the practiced smile of patience settling onto her face. "That's very kind," she said gently. "But you don't even know me." The boy frowned, not offended but thoughtful. "I know enough," he replied. Ira tilted her head slightly. "What do you know?" "That you're alone," he said, "and that you look at the sky like you're waiting for something." She had not realized anyone noticed. He was too young to understand that's what she believed. His name was Ethan Miller, 7 years old, lived with his grandmother 2 blocks away, quiet at school, polite, observant, dangerously observant. Ira learned this over the following weeks as he appeared again and again, sometimes at the library, sometimes near the river path where she walked at dusk. He never chased her, never demanded attention. He simply spoke when he had something to say. Children, she had learned, were inefficient communicators. Ethan was not. "Are you going to leave?" he asked one afternoon. "Yes," she answered honestly. "Someday," he nodded. "That's okay, I'll wait." She smiled again, amused this time. "You won't even remember me when you're older." He shook his head immediately. "I will." There was no stubbornness in his voice, only certainty. That was when Ira made her first mistake. She laughed. Time did not move the same way for her. To Ira, years were brief, a gentle drift. To humans, they were everything. She watched Ethan grow the way one watched seasons change, noticeable only in hindsight. His voice deepened. His questions became more complex. He stopped talking about marriage but not about the future. "What do you want to be?" she asked him once when he was 10. "Someone who keeps promises," he said. She said nothing after that. The first warning came from her superiors shortly after. Subject attachment forming, emotional projection detected, reassignment recommended. She delayed, just a little. The promise was never spoken again. By the time Ethan turned 12, Ira avoided him, not because she feared him, because she feared herself. She had begun to anticipate his presence, to feel a subtle tightening in her chest when she saw him across the street, to remember his words not as data but as weight. Promises were dangerous things, especially human ones. On the day she finally left town, she stood at the edge of the river path, watching the water move endlessly forward. She did not say goodbye. She told herself it was mercy. Years later, the galaxy noticed him. Ira did not expect to see his name again. She was stationed light years away, embedded in a neutral trade hub, when a familiar phonetic structure appeared in a human diplomatic file. Miller, Ethan age, 23 field, aerospace systems engineering psych profile, anomalously stable noted traits, long-term commitment, high resilience, refusal to abandon objectives. Ira stared at the screen longer than protocol allowed. Humans were not supposed to remember alien girls from their childhood. And yet her internal calm chimed. "Observer Ira, you are requested for consultation." Human subject involved. She felt something human rise in her chest, fear. She had believed the promise was childish, temporary, forgot. She was wrong. And somewhere on Earth a grown man looked up at the sky, not with longing but with purpose, still carrying a promise he had never taken back. Ira did not request the file. That was the first sign she was no longer thinking like an observer. The consultation chamber overlooked the trade hub's artificial star, an engineered construct that provided light but no warmth. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the slow rotation of vessels beyond the glass, while the name remained suspended in her thoughts like an unresolved equation. Ethan Miller, the boy who had spoken with certainty, the child who had looked at her as if the future were negotiable. The door behind her opened with a soft chime. "Observer Ira," the liaison said. "Thank you for attending." She turned, composed once more. "Explain the relevance." The liaison hesitated. That, too, was Data. "The human delegation has requested a cultural mediator," he said, "someone with longitudinal familiarity." Ira felt the smallest fracture form in her calm. "You knew," she said. "Yes," the liaison admitted. "Your early field records were reviewed." The implication was clear. The galaxy had noticed the pattern before she had allowed herself to. The boy had become a man the galaxy took seriously. The briefing was clinical. Ethan Miller had not risen through spectacle or aggression. He had done so through persistence, quiet competence, a reputation for following through when others recalculated. He specialized in systems designed to last, long-range habitats, deep space infrastructure, projects that required decades of commitment. He was known among his peers for a phrase he rarely explained: "Some things are worth waiting for." Ira closed the file. "Why am I necessary?" she asked. "Because," the liaison said carefully, "he requested you by name." That was not possible. She had never told him her name. She had never told him anything that would survive childhood. Unless humans remembered differently. Reunion is a dangerous thing when time is uneven. The meeting chamber was smaller than she expected. No grand hall. No ceremonial distance. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a human standing near the viewport, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed in the way of someone who had learned patience early. He turned when he heard her enter. Ira stopped. The resemblance was unmistakable, not in features but in presence, the same stillness, the same way his eyes searched before he spoke. He did not smile, he did not rush. He simply said quietly, "You left without saying goodbye." The words landed with precision. "I was assigned elsewhere," she replied, defaulting to neutrality. "I figured," he said. "That's usually how important things disappear." She met his gaze fully now. "You remember," she said. "Yes," Ethan replied, "not everything, just what mattered." There was no accusation in his voice, only fact. Promises age differently in humans. They spoke for hours. Not about the promise, not at first, about work, about distance, about how strange it was to speak across species lines without feeling like strangers. Ira observed herself closely. Her heart rate was elevated. Her cognitive latency increased slightly, her composure imperfect. At last she asked the question she could no longer avoid. "Why did you ask for me?" Ethan leaned back slightly, considering. "Because every projection your people ran about humans assumes we forget," he said. "That we grow out of things. That time erases intention." He looked at her directly. "It doesn't," he continued. "It clarifies it." Ira felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. "And the promise?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. "I was a child," he said. "I didn't understand marriage or species or consequences." She nodded, relieved. "But," he added, "I understood choice." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy. "I'm not asking you to honor something said by a boy," Ethan said carefully. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that he meant it, and that the man he became didn't forget why." The galaxy was watching the wrong question. The observers focused on treaties, on compatibility, on political risk. They did not understand the true anomaly unfolding in that room. Not that a human loved an alien, but that a human had chosen a future and grown into it. Ira stood slowly. "I need time," she said. Ethan nodded. "I know." She paused at the door, then spoke without turning. "I didn't leave because I forgot you," she said. "I left because I was afraid you would grow and I would not." "And did you?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said, "just not in the way I expected." Some choices do not expire. As the door closed behind her, Ira felt the quiet certainty of something irreversible approaching. The boy had grown. The promise had endured. And for the first time in her long existence, she was not being asked to observe a future but to step into one. The galaxy would adjust, as it always did, but this time it would not be because of war or discovery or force. It would be because a child's promise had outlived the stars that once separated them. Ira did not sleep. That too was new. Her kind entered restorative cycles with ease, thoughts slowing, memory consolidating, emotion settling into order. This night, however, her mind refused alignment. The meeting replayed itself in fragments, Ethan's voice, steady and unguarded, the way he had not tried to impress or persuade, the certainty that did not demand anything from her. He had grown into the promise without asking her to keep it. That was the most dangerous part. Observers prefer variables that can be measured. The next cycle brought summons, not requests. Ira stood before the Oversight Council in a chamber designed to diminish individuality. No names were spoken, only designations. "You are compromised," one voice stated. "I am contextualized," Ira replied calmly. A pause, then, "The human's persistence is statistically anomalous." "Yes," Ira said, "that is humanity. You were not meant to become a reference point," another voice said. "You were meant to extract data." "I did," Ira answered. "You simply did not value the result." Silence followed. They were recalculating. Ethan refused to be a problem back on Earth. Ethan continued his work. He did not grant interviews, did not posture, did not leverage his position for influence. When asked about the alien mediation request, he answered simply, "I knew someone once, she mattered." That unsettled people more than ambition ever could. When officials suggested reassignment, distance, delay, alternatives, he declined politely and continued forward. His projects moved ahead anyway. Others adjusted around him, not because he demanded it, but because resisting him required more effort than cooperation. Humans, Ira realized, were not dangerous because they resisted control. They were dangerous because they outlasted it. The second meeting changed the equation this time. Ira requested it. The room was the same, the view unchanged. Ethan was already there. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes," she replied. "I did." She sat across from him, not as an observer, not as an anomaly, but as herself. "I cannot promise you permanence," she said. "My lifespan does not align with yours. My obligations are not finished. And if I choose this, if I choose you, there will be consequences beyond either of us." Ethan listened carefully. Then he said, "I know." That was it. No bargaining, no reassurance, just acceptance. "I don't need certainty," he continued. "I grew up without it. What I need is honesty and choice." Ira felt something settle, a long-held tension easing. The promise reframed. "I remember what I said," Ethan added after a moment. "And I know now it wasn't about marriage, not really." She waited. "It was about deciding early," he said. "About not letting the world tell me what was impossible before I tried." Ira looked at him, this human who had grown not into fantasy but into resolve. "You did not wait for me," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "I became someone worth meeting again." The words struck deeper than any declaration of love could have. Choice is loud in a quiet universe. When Ira returned to the council, her decision was already visible in her posture. "I am invoking autonomy," she said. "I will remain as liaison with human Ethan Miller." "That is unprecedented," a voice warned. "So was my assignment," Ira replied. "The council did not approve. They did not deny. They observed." A future without guarantees on a hill overlooking the city where they first met again. Not the river path, not the library, but a place chosen by neither of them and therefore belonging to both. Ira stood beside Ethan as dusk settled. "I don't know where this leads," she said. He smiled faintly. "Neither did 7-year-old me." She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the weight of time not as loss but as accumulation. "I cannot promise to stay forever," she said. "I know," he replied. She took his hand. "But," she added, "I am here now." That was enough. Above them the sky held its silence, indifferent and vast. And somewhere within it models adjusted again, not because a promise had been fulfilled exactly as spoken, but because it had been honored in the only way that mattered. They did not rush into anything. That, more than declarations or defiance, unsettled everyone watching. Time became a shared language. Ira remained on Earth as a liaison, officially tasked with cultural continuity assessment. Unofficially, she was being studied as closely as humanity itself. She and Ethan met often but never hid. They walked public streets, sat in quiet cafes, spoke about work, memory, and the strange weight of being known by someone who had seen you at two entirely different points in your life. Once, as they stood at a crosswalk watching traffic pass, Ethan said, almost absently, "You still look the same." Ira nodded. "And you don't," he smiled. Good. That word good carried more meaning than he probably realized. For her people, change was failure. Drift from baseline meant inefficiency. For humans, change meant progress. She was learning to translate between those truths. The weight of growing up. One evening, as they reviewed old satellite images for a joint project, Ethan pulled up a local archive, scanned photos from the town library. There she was, or rather her human interface, standing beside a much smaller version of him, both of them caught mid-laughter by a volunteer photographer. Ira stared at the image longer than necessary. "I didn't know this existed," she said. "I forgot about it," Ethan replied. "Found it last year. I kept it." "Why?" He shrugged. "I guess that I didn't imagine you." She reached out and touched the screen lightly. "You didn't," she said, the question he didn't ask. Weeks passed before Ethan finally spoke the thought that hovered unspoken between them. "If I hadn't said anything back then," he asked one night, "would this still have happened?" Ira considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said at last, "but differently." "How so?" "You would have grown, I would have observed. We might have met again." She paused. "But I would not have recognized you as the same human," he nodded slowly. "So the promise mattered." "Yes," she said, "because it gave continuity to your intention, and intention is rare." The galaxy tests boundaries gently. The council did not intervene directly. Instead, they applied pressure, delayed approvals, extended reviews, requests that required Ira to leave Earth for longer intervals. None of it was overt. All of it was strategic. Ethan noticed immediately. "They're trying to stretch us," he said. "Yes," Ira replied, "to see what yields first." "And if neither does," Ira met his gaze, "then they will have learned something new." No grand declaration, there was no dramatic announcement, no ceremony, no vow. The moment that mattered happened quietly in Ethan's apartment as rain traced slow paths down the windows. Ira stood near the bookshelf studying a stack of old notebooks. "These are yours," she said. "Yeah, bad ideas mostly." She picked one up, flipping through pages filled with diagrams, notes, half-written thoughts. "You plan long-term," she observed. "I learned early that some things take time," he said. She turned toward him. "So did I," she replied. "I just didn't know it yet." She closed the notebook and set it down. Then she stepped closer, not hesitant, not uncertain, intentional. Ethan didn't move. He waited. When she took his hand, it wasn't symbolic. It was a decision. The promise fulfilled differently later, much later, as the city slept. Ethan spoke softly. "You know, I didn't mean marriage the way adults mean it." "I know," Ira said. "I meant staying," he continued. "Choosing the same person tomorrow as today." She rested her head against his shoulder. "That," she said, "is closer to how my people define eternity." Observers update their models, reports circulated. Not alarms, not warnings, just revisions. Human attachment classified as non-transient. Early intention correlated with long-term behavioral consistency. Cross-species bonds deemed stabilizing, not disruptive. The galaxy did not panic, it adapted. A future that didn't need certainty. On the anniversary of their reunion, they returned to the river path where Ira had once watched water move endlessly forward. Ethan skipped a stone across the surface, smiling as it vanished beneath the ripples. "Do you ever wish you'd corrected me?" he asked. "Back then." She shook her head. "No," she said. "If I had, you might have doubted yourself, and that would have changed everything." He looked at her, thoughtful. "So the kid wasn't wrong." She met his gaze, eyes warm and steady. "He wasn't early," she said. "He was precise." They stood there as the light faded, neither in a hurry, neither afraid of what time would take next, because some promises don't need to be repeated. They only need to be grown into. The seasons changed around them, quietly and without ceremony. That, Ira learned, was how the most important transformations always happened on Earth. Growing into the same direction, they never announced what they were to each other. There was no moment where a word defined it, no labels, no declarations meant for an audience. Instead, there were habits that formed naturally, almost unnoticed at first. Ethan began keeping a second mug by the sink even when she wasn't staying over. Ira adjusted her work schedules without being asked, aligning her off-world briefings so they never overlapped his longest absences. Neither mentioned it, both noticed. When people asked Ethan about her, he said, "She's part of my life." When observers asked Ira about him, she said, "He is a constant." Both statements were true. Neither felt exaggerated. Time pressed, gently but relentlessly. Ira aged slowly but visibly now. The subtle changes were not alarming, just undeniable. Ethan, being human, noticed everything. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, he traced the faint line at the corner of her eye with his thumb. "That wasn't there before," he said quietly. She nodded. "It will continue." He didn't look away. "Good." She studied his face. "Why?" "Because it means you're here," he said. "Not visiting." The words settled into her chest with surprising weight. "Here." The question that couldn't be avoided, it came one evening after a long walk, when the city lights were beginning to flicker on and the air smelled like rain. Ethan stopped near the edge of the overlook and rested his arms on the railing. "You know," he said, "I don't expect you to stay forever." Ira turned toward him, attentive. "But I need to know something," he continued. "When you look ahead, however far you see, do I exist there?" The question was not desperate. It was precise. She did not answer immediately. "For my people," she said slowly, "the future is something you optimize, you choose outcomes, you minimize loss." "And for you?" he asked. "For me," she replied, "the future is something you step into without knowing if it will hold." She met his eyes. "And yes," she said, "you are there." Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's enough," he said. Observers learn a new metric. The council's reports shifted tone. Where once they cataloged risk, they now noted resilience. Where once they flagged deviation, they now tracked coherence. Ira's presence on Earth had not destabilized her. It had anchored her. Human long-term intention, once considered an inefficiency, was reclassified as a stabilizing force, particularly when formed early and carried forward without erosion. The galaxy did not celebrate this finding. It simply incorporated it. That was progress. A quiet decision, the moment that changed everything, did not happen during a crisis. It happened in a grocery store. They stood in the aisle, debating the merits of two brands of tea. Ethan reached for one, then paused. "We always buy this one," he said. Ira tilted her head. "You dislike it." "I do," he agreed, "but you like it." She considered this. "Is that acceptable?" she asked. He smiled. "It's normal." She placed the box in the cart. That night after dinner, she spoke without preamble. "I want to formalize my stay." Ethan looked up from the table. "With the council?" "Yes," she said, "and with you." He didn't respond immediately. He stood, walked around the table, and rested his hands on the back of her chair. "Say that again," he said gently. "I am choosing Earth," she said, "and I am choosing you as the reason I stay." The boy's promise had never asked for ownership, only direction. What marriage meant, at last they did not follow human tradition exactly. Nor did they invent something alien. They chose something simple, a shared residence, legal recognition, a declaration not to the galaxy but to each other that their lives would be planned together. When Ethan signed the documents, his hand was steady. When Ira added her designation, she hesitated only long enough to change it. Not observer, resident. The promise, fully grown years later, when someone asked Ethan how long they had been together, he smiled and said, "Longer than it looks." When someone asked Ira why she stayed on a planet that would never fully understand her, she answered, "Because someone here understood me early." They returned once more to the river path, the same place where a child had spoken a future into existence. Ethan skipped a stone across the water. Ira watched the ripples spread outward, intersecting, reshaping one another. "I said I'd marry you," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Eventually." She stepped closer, her hand slipping into his. "You did," she said, "and you were right." Not because the words had been magical, but because he had grown into them, and that far more than prophecy or destiny was what made them true. The world accepted them more easily than either had expected. That perhaps was the final surprise. Normal became the rarest luxury. They moved into a modest house on the edge of town, not hidden, not symbolic, just practical. Close enough to Ethan's work, far enough that Ira could step outside at night and still see stars without city glare. They argued about ordinary things, schedules, noise, whether windows should stay open at night. These disagreements fascinated Ira more than any diplomatic negotiation she had ever witnessed. Conflict without threat, resolution without dominance. Humans did not optimize harmony, they worked at it. One evening, after a particularly stubborn disagreement about furniture placement, Ethan leaned back against the wall and laughed. "You know," he said, "if anyone from your council could see this, they'd probably revoke your clearance." Ira considered the couch, then him. "Let them," she said. "This matters more." The weight of being chosen early, Ethan sometimes wondered who he might have been without the promise. Not bitterly, just curiously, would he have drifted, compromised more? Let time decide instead of intention. One night, as they lay awake listening to distant rain, he asked her, "Do you ever think I tied myself to something too early?" Ira turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. "No," she said, "you anchored yourself. There is a difference. And if I had changed my mind, then the promise would have served its purpose anyway," she replied. "It gave you direction until you found your own." He smiled softly. "That's a very generous interpretation." "It's accurate," she said. "The galaxy records a footnote far beyond Earth, in archives that would never be public. A minor annotation was added to a long-standing dataset. Case study: early human intent persistence outcome. Stable cross-temporal bond conclusion. Intent formed before full cognition can mature into durable identity. No alarms followed. No interventions. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something once dismissed as childish could, under the right conditions, become foundational. The universe did not mock humanity for its promises. It learned from them. Ira crossed a line she could not uncross years later when Ethan's hair was more silver than brown. Ira stood before the council once more. This time she was not summoned. She requested audience. "I will not return," she said calmly. There was no outrage, no threat, only a question. "Do you understand what you relinquish?" "Yes," Ira replied, "and I understand what I keep." "Your bond will end," one voice warned. "All bonds do," Ira inclined her head. "So do stars," she said. "Yet they are worth forming." The council did not object. They recorded and let her go. The small boy would have recognized the man one afternoon long after the world had stopped paying attention to their story. Ethan and Ira returned to the old library. The building had been renovated. New paint, new windows, the awning replaced. But the concrete was the same. Ethan stood there quietly. "I don't remember what I was wearing," he said, "or what I'd had for lunch, just that I felt certain." Ira smiled gently. "You were," she said. "Certainty is not age-dependent." He looked at her. "Do you think you would have stayed if I hadn't said anything?" She took his hand. "I think," she said, "you gave me permission to imagine a future that included change." He squeezed her fingers. "Guess we both grew up then." The promise at rest on their anniversary. Though neither could agree which moment truly counted, they sat outside as dusk settled in familiar colors. No speeches, no reflection, just presence. Ethan rested his head back and closed his eyes. Ira watched the sky. She no longer counted stars. She no longer waited for signals. She had everything she needed in the quiet weight of shared time. The promise had not been dramatic. It had not been prophetic. It had simply been kept, not through insistence, but through growth. And in a universe obsessed with power, efficiency, and certainty, that small human thing remained quietly revolutionary. The years that followed did not blur. They layered. What staying really meant, Ira learned that permanence was not a single decision. It was a series of quiet renewals. Choosing to wake beside the same person even when novelty faded. Choosing patience when misunderstanding surfaced. Choosing presence when leaving would have been easier. For her people, commitment was enforced by structure. For humans, it was sustained by repetition. That difference mattered. Ethan never asked her to justify staying. He never treated her choice as fragile or heroic. He treated it as normal, and in doing so made it so. That, Ira realized, was one of humanity's most disarming traits. The child's promise changed shape. They encountered children often, neighbors, nieces, the curious kids who asked too many questions and accepted answers without suspicion. Once, a young girl looked up at Ira and asked, "Are you a princess?" Ira smiled. "No, "What are you then?" Ethan answered before she could. "She's someone who kept a promise," he said. The child considered this seriously. "That sounds hard." "It is," Ira said gently, "but it's worth it." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. She met his eyes, calm and certain. Time took what it always takes. Ethan aged faster than she did. They both knew it. They never pretended otherwise. Some mornings his joints protested. Some nights fatigue came sooner than it once had. Ira adjusted instinctively, slowing her pace, matching his rhythms, learning the human art of accompaniment. One evening, as she helped him up the steps after a long walk, he chuckled. "You know," he said, "7-year-old me had no idea how much work this would be." Ira smiled. "Nor did I. Still worth it." She didn't answer with words. She kissed his temple carefully, deliberately. "Yes," she said. The galaxy moved on, and so did they. Other anomalies arose elsewhere. Other species tested boundaries, formed attachments, reclassified assumptions. Earth was no longer unique, but it had been first, and firsts leave impressions. Ira no longer received updates from the Council. Not because she was forgotten, but because she was no longer relevant to their immediate projections. She welcomed that. For the first time in her long existence, she was not data, she was simply a life. The final lesson was simple. One quiet night, as wind moved softly through the trees and the house settled around them, Ethan spoke without opening his eyes. "Do you ever think about that boy?" he asked. "Yes," Ira replied. "What would you tell him now?" She thought for a long moment. "I would tell him," she said, "that he was brave for saying what he felt, and wiser than he knew for being willing to wait." Ethan smiled faintly. "I think he'd like that." She rested her hand over his. "I think," she added, "he already knew." What remained when people later tried to explain their story? They reached for big ideas, destiny, fate, cosmic coincidence, but none of those were quite right. It had never been about inevitability. It had been about continuity. A child spoke a future aloud. A man grew into it. An alien chose to change. And the universe, vast, indifferent, endlessly complex, made room for that choice. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was kept.